Well, hello. You're back with our old Kentucky home, and I'm Russ, and I'm with Dave and Roy in various places, including Maine, which is it the anniversary of the Missouri Compromise? Because certainly, I think it must be something like that. But anyway, I'm
Coming up,
immediately
yeah.
throwing you into my history bit. It was in Heather Cox Richardson report today about it, but it may not be the anniversary. But anyway, we can get to that later. But anyway, Roy's in Maine, Dave's in Indiana, I'm in Wales, and we last week talked about politics, but our kind of historical perspectives of when we were growing up in our old Kentucky home, otherwise known as Bardstown. But we thought, and we weren't allowed to say the T word, and Roy wasn't allowed to go out on any riffs or rants or any other R words. But this week we thought, well, we'll take the cuffs off, the leash off, the muzzle off, and everything else, and we'll just go for it because, as the Chinese say in a curse, we are living in interesting times. So anyway, I'm just going to kind of open it up and see if anybody has any immediate pithy comments they want to make. They aren't going to take the whole 45 minutes. And then we'll sort of try to focus things. So, Dave, what are your perspectives of what's been going on?
Given your comment about Roy taking the cuffs off, the gentleman from Indiana is going to cede his time to the gentleman from Maine.
Uh,
Well, the chair recognizes the gentleman from Maine, although gentleman, I think, is probably questionable.
Just pushing it there, yes, definitely pushing it. I don't know. I mean, we all live in the same country here that's kind of being turned on its head at the moment. And I think we're in gasoline prices have gone down 2 cents here. So there's that. My 401k has gone down 4%. So I'm not sure it balances really, as but hey,
I
take
noticed
what you
eggs are still 20 bucks a dozen or
It's
something.
something like that. I think they're golden eggs now. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's uh but people I've been told to stop talking about egg prices by my uh I hate to use the term friends on Facebook, my acquaintances on Facebook. So yeah, which means I just keep posting about it. But anyways, it's an interesting time. Definitely what you said. It's hard to see. Yeah, and I believe you've used in your Substack a couple of times. It's kind of like being in the upside down.
Yeah.
It's wrong is right, and that kind of thing. So
I was trying to think if there's a historical period that matches it, and I mean, there probably are, but you probably have to go back pretty far, and the most recent would probably be the Great Depression and the transition between uh, Herbert Hoover and
mhm.
Roosevelt. But there was no point in that period in which there was a divide of opinion that the country was either great or awful. Everybody pretty much knew it was awful, and there was just the opinion about what you needed to do about it. But here
Mhm.
we're in a situation in which we come in that, on many metrics, the U.S. economy was the best in the world. And yet the entering administration says it's the worst in the world and we've got to fix everything. In order to do that, we've got to break everything.
Mhm.
Uh, and then suddenly, economically, it's not that way. So we're in a situation, I think, that's completely different, even though the situation during the Depression was equally severe, but people don't share the same view of it. It's almost like you're looking at the same disaster, and one saying, "Oh, look at that pretty fire, the glow from the flames," and the other saying, "Oh, gosh, look at the destruction." You're looking at,
It's kind of odd because you really don't know, like you said, in FDR's time, everybody was sure what we're trying to do is at least move in the direction of economic recovery, but you really wonder what the end goal is right now
yeah,
Mhm.
with some of the, other than just to stir things up. I know Trump says he wants to lower the deficit, lower the budget. And so I guess, what cost do some of those things come? And you say, well, it's a mix. Through the campaign 3 months ago, JD Vance was out saying the economy's in shambles. Well, this week I saw him in an interview. They were asking him about recession and inflation, and he says, "Well, the economy's in really good shape right now."
Yeah. Yeah.
And
I
so,
think he's
yeah,
holding the stock market thing upside down or something. I don't know.
that could be it. I don't really understand, who these guys think they're talking to sometimes.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
during the first
like
Trump administration, the stock market was watched, continuously because it was on a continuous up until COVID. Now, of
Mhm.
course, I don't watch the stock market, which I think would be
It means
news to
nothing.
his cryptocurrency thing and everything else that he's involved with. But
Yeah.
it is an interesting perspective that we're in. Um,
Well, it's certainly the case too that it could have been. I mean, the stock market crashing was imminently predictable once you put tariffs on and you
yeah,
start doing this. It's just, but it's not. I'm not clear if the administration is being disingenuous about tariffs that or they simply just don't actually understand what they are, because they keep saying things like it's not a tax, it's not a tax, or it's a tax on the foreign companies, and it's in no way, shape, or form does it impact the foreign companies except maybe less demand, but it definitely impacts consumers
yeah.
when our importers pay the tax and they pass it on to us. So I don't know if they're just being disingenuous, which God knows a politician would never do that, or if they're just dumb.
Well, Roy, keep in mind that if you've got a lot of money, you like a user's tax.
Yeah.
And so you pay for things you use, which is a regressive form of taxation.
Mhm.
And so if you put a tax on something or put a tariff on something, and you're right, you're collecting that tariff, or you could say a tax for goods coming into the country. And you're right, that foreign country or foreign manufacturer or even the local manufacturer is paying that tariff, which is that tax, which then allows the government to collect the tariff, even though the consumer good goes up price,
Mhm.
which is a regression, in some ways, regressive taxation, which if they swing it right, then they can lower the income tax on all the people that really can afford to pay an income tax.
Yep.
So maybe that's the game.
It all
I could
works
be the
if
game. It
it's
could be.
coherent.
I'm sorry.
I just say it all works if it's coherent. Unfortunately, the coherency of these particular measures is obscure to say the least, or to be oxymoronic, really, which may be the absolutely perfect word to describe it. Um, yeah, so that's kind of our ground rules. Everybody knows kind of where we are. Who's going to be listening to this? More than likely, anyone who's listened beyond the first introduction will agree with us, and anybody else will have thrown the computer across the room. Uh, there
Well,
will probably
it's
be a
us and Bo
tariff on
basically.
trying to buy a new one, so I would be watch out for that, and it's going to be really hard to repair. I thought it might be worth talking a little bit about what it feels like literally on the ground rather than in the paper, because over here in Wales, of course, nobody feels any of this kind of stuff yet. You only get it on social media probably as much as anything, or maybe some of the newspapers. Now, most of the newspapers, even the more left right wing ones, aren't overly impressed by what's been going on. So you're not getting a whole chorus of right wing as opposed to left wing support for what's happening. But what's it feel like on the ground there? Just
Well, I would ask Roy if he knows much about the situation in Maine between the governor and the president, because I know the president seems to have retaliated against some of the things that the governor of Maine
Yep.
has said. So I would again bow to what's going on there, Roy.
We do feel a little targeted at the moment. They uh, targeted the University of Maine and stopped USDA grants, which is a land grant university. So that's a major source of revenue, source of grant money. It's 30 million or something. It's not the majority of our grant money, but it's a chunk. Um, and they did that on the grounds of investigating Title IX things, but they never accused UMaine of anything like that. So it was obviously a retribution for on the part of the governor. Now, Susan Collins stopped clutching her pearls and saying, "Oh my," long enough to actually get in there and convince them to free up the money again. But that's the kind of thing that we're doing on a daily basis here. Is we're seeing just exactly what everybody expected: retribution by the Trump administration. The governor is still basically giving him the middle finger, which I think is the appropriate reaction because she was following the law because Title IX, according to the Supreme Court, covers gender as well as sex and whatnot. So she's very much following the law as the Supreme Court has interpreted it. But what she got in trouble for was when she told Trump that he said, "Well, no, we are the law." Après moi, not après moi, but that's the different quote. But l'état c'est moi. Right? Yeah. So Louis the XIV, I told somebody jokingly that I'm more a fan of Louis the XVI in this particular situation, but nonetheless, that's where it is here. It feels this is a fairly liberal state. It's three-quarter liberal. We're the only state now that splits our electoral votes. So unfortunately, I live in the red side of the state, but locally, it's a university area, so it's pretty blue. We do have reasonable senators. We've had reasonable politicians our entire history. Margaret Chase Smith, George Mitchell, all kinds of folks that worked across the aisle. Susan Collins holds the same seat that Margaret Chase Smith did, but who stood up for against McCarthyism, but she has yet to rise to the occasion. But here, personally, it feels like we are watching the country slip away as the government does things like USAID, dissolve that, leaving literally millions of people in the lurch across the world that thought they could count on the United States. The revoking ask is going to Supreme Court now has basically told the Trump administration, yes, you have to pay your bills to contractors. I was listening to something that basically said, a government contract used to be basically the same as cash because, of course, we would pay our bills. If we lose that and we lose the ability for our friends, which are now, I guess, our enemies, but our friends to rely on us as partners, it's going to take a long time to get that trust back from other countries. And I think that's one of the things that I see is already being damaged beyond repair for the foreseeable future. So I personally, could just be me, and my little neighborhood here where there's only like one Trump flag flying still. It could be just me, but I feel, a sense of gloom and doom that I don't feel I'm overreacting. I feel like that many of us are underreacting to the things that are going on. That's how it feels to me, that the United States has lost its way and is bumbling into 1930s Germany.
We were always in a situation in which, policies could change, but foreign policy for the most part was consistent, and certainly consistent since the post-war. And that's the bedrock of everything. And while, in 4 years' time or even 2 years' time, all that could change, I think the realization now is that it's far more tenuous than anyone ever thought it was going to be. I mean, everybody thought the one thing you could count on was NATO, kind of the Western alliance, and there might be some snits between, people one side or another. Everybody figured the big fault line was going to be someplace like France or Germany, where the right wing could come in there, which entirely is possible. But no one ever suspected it was going to be the United States. And that while Putin is not a communist, he is the inheritor of everything that the communist state and the Soviet state was, and he's busily reattaching it. So every time anybody sort of gives him some kind of kudos or due because of his grievances, well, they've had those grievances since 1917, and we've been opposed to them ever since. So, So yeah, I think that's the thing. It's the realization now how quickly things could change because we
Yeah.
thought in the bureaucratic state that everything took time, and that was its virtue, and we thought we beat our head against the wall as progressives because you think, why can't we change something tomorrow? Well, you really don't want to be able to change things that fast because when you
Yeah,
do,
yeah, I would add when you talk about the timing and the length of time, that people say, well, what's going to stop it? And to my opinion, it's always been the courts. If you were lucky, you get the right judge, but those things take time and it takes time to evolve and so on. But I think even this afternoon, I think there was a judge I mean, Trump wanted to deport a group of Venezuelan gang members, and a judge stopped them and said, you can't do that. And I think from what I'm hearing this afternoon, Trump deported them anyway.
right,
He did,
So
and the judge even said turn the airplanes around
right.
and ignored it. Yep, go
and
ahead.
so yeah, and so the question is that, if the courts are saying stop, then who enforces the court's order?
Yeah.
And I don't know the answer to that. The
Well,
Department of Justice is completely in Trump's back pocket, or at least
mhm.
federal level. You've got Republican senators who are saying that if a judge goes against Trump's orders, then we ought to look at what we can do to impeach that judge, remove them from the bench. And so, and when you hear talk like that, it becomes a little bit scary for us as Americans because the system that we've always relied upon, seems to be it's being circumvented by somebody who's actually acting like a German blitzkrieg rather than
Mhm.
somebody that's following the American system. So,
It's
I think
exposing
just
a lot of the weaknesses in our system that we never really realized because we never really realized there would be a movement like this and a person like Trump leading it in this country. And the founding fathers had no real idea this would ever happen, I don't think, because the checks and balances depends on people actually observing the law
yeah.
and people doing what they need to. And if you ignore the courts, then, as you say, there's no check on the executive.
well,
And
and
Congress is not going to impeach because, you know,
you always thought there'd be a moral actor in positions of leadership. And I
mhm.
know some people are praise Trump for his cowboy character and deporting the Venezuelans as part of that cowboy character. We're going to do what they think is right, regardless of what the rule of law says. I've had students, I used to teach a business law class. I had students once tell me years and years ago that they don't believe non-women and men should be deciding what happens in this country. And, I kind of look at them, then who? Well, somebody that they agree with, obviously.
Yeah.
So,
So they
Yeah.
so they believe one man should decide what happens in the country.
yeah, that isn't exactly what they said, but I guess if
Yeah,
you
Yeah.
it's
agree
an
with the one,
interesting it's an interesting point of view, and the fact is they don't entirely, and sometimes they do, but a lot of that is because of I take it usually back to the congressional release of power that has happened even since the Second World War, but certainly since Vietnam, in which the powers to declare war were ceded to a president. And then the powers, therefore, to fund it and everything else were, because if it's not a war, then the Congress doesn't have to fund it. It can come out, all these kinds. So the if you look at the Constitution, there's not a balance of power. There is an imbalance of power, and the imbalance weighs in the direction of Congress. It has far more inherent powers in the Constitution than either the judiciary or the executive has. But
Mhm.
it no longer does, or it doesn't, because if you have a Congress that's in the same party as the president and you're enthralled to him, then all of those checks and balances are gone. I mean, we've seen this. I mean, Andrew Jackson did that in the Indian removals. He ignored Supreme Court rulings at that point. So it has happened before. It has happened in ways in which administrations have sort of stonewalled and slow walked and things like
Mhm.
that. But in the end, the balances have worked out. but we're in a position now. Interestingly, this has been identified, but it's in a very little known speech by Abraham Lincoln in 1836, I think, to the Young Men's Lyceum Club in Springfield, Illinois, and it was like a Toastmasters club, except they spoke about really interesting topics, and they come in. The topic for this week is going to be blah blah blah, and you'd make a speech about it. So one of his first recorded speeches is on essentially the future of the American system, and in it he says, and this is one of his first enumerations of his notion that the Declaration of Independence is actually the founding document, almost rather than the Constitution. But he also says the risk to the country will not be from external sources. It will be from somebody, rising up out of our own, in trying to make something of themselves. And it's really kind of hearkening back to what happened to the Roman Empire as well. So I think, interestingly, the guy who probably single-handedly secured more power to the presidency than any other, but also was more than willing to step down in the middle of a war, identified way before he was even close to being in politics that this kind of thing was possible.
Well, I think it's interesting you mentioned Jackson, that is one of Trump's heroes.
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
And he would be. The guy who, in his probably unconstitutional battle against the Bank of the United States, killed it, and therefore left the country in its first really huge depression. So we've got that to look forward to. That was the result of the people's president, who thought a good individual knows good common sense. Not. So yeah, we're in a strange time right now, that has probably never been predicted, but isn't completely surprising given the weaknesses, I guess, of democracy in general, which is to say that if you can vote your enemy in, and then they can assume the wheels of power and all the wheels that are there, they can do quite a bit of damage.
And first in Trump 1, T45, he was very incompetent in terms of grabbing power because he didn't have a coherent plan. He had guardrails in the sense of people, even I don't agree with John Bolton on anything, but at least people in there that had some experience and were willing to act as sort of guardrails. And Trump was very naive about power, the actual power of the office. But in the 4 years, the interregnum, he has great help from people like Heritage Society and Project 2025 that spent 4 years planning this out. And he is basically following Project 2025's playbook, as well as putting one of those people in charge of, I think it's OMB, is it? But he had some very, very smart people, possibly, in my opinion, evil, but very smart people planning out how to do this. And he's following right along. So he's much more competent at being an authoritarian this time around.
Well, as you said, he's got different
come
people
out of
around
nowhere
him.
either. I mean, this is a long time coming, and the people that people still revere, like Ronald Reagan, have their responsibility in it, even though he was a respecter of as much as any president does, a respecter of the Congress and the balance of powers and the Constitution and everything else, as much as he could have understood it, which I'm not entirely sure was all that much. Still, the rhetoric that came out from 1980 was the horrors of the big government, and then that carries on to Gingrich against Clinton, and then finally we get the Tea Party, which is clearly the racist reaction to a black man in the White House, and this is the culmination of all of that. That somehow or another, the government that is for better and for worse, but also for better, is the responsibility for why America is as great as it is. And we'll talk about that kind of concept in a minute. Comes from government. It's way too complicated, and it's way too big of a country to be otherwise. But if you've got ideologues who believe otherwise, then they get in power. There you are. So I think that we're there. We're surrounded by one chancer and a bunch of true believers, and that's a dangerous cocktail for things as they were. Let me ask you this. We were talking about this before we started. I find these kind of situations rife for irony, but unfortunately, irony doesn't go very far, or satire, in terms of making things better. But it does seem rather ironic that the center and the left, which have always been the ones who sort of wag our fingers at America for its wrongdoings in the world or its failings, are now forced to be the defenders of its moral mission in the world, whereas the person in charge and the party in charge, who were just in the last administration regaling people for not being pro-America and talking about all our virtues, are the ones saying, yeah, we're just like everybody else. Perspectives on that?
You talk about these people. I think the thing is that when you graduate from a business school and you're trained about economics and the value of property and so on, it's tough to leave business school without having some traditionally Republican leanings. The rights of property and the rights of the individual, and and then you throw in there, pull yourself up from your bootstraps kind of thing, entrepreneurial spirit. But I think that when you see that wing of the party, or that part of the party, has really become kind of moderated, because the party center has moved so far to the right that I think there are a lot of people who classify themselves as Republicans and have yet to figure out that they should no longer vote Republican, or really feel that the Republican Party has left them so far to the right. So when you go so far to one side of the pendulum, I think the forces are such that you got to figure out, how do you bring that pendulum back to center? And so then you have your left, and your center is, as you say, Russ, talking about, wait a minute, what we're doing is totally wrong. We may have been bad before, but let's talk about the good things, because what you're doing now is really bad. So I think, that's why they're saying, look at what the good we've done now. They're forced to say it that way.
Yeah. I found myself using a term I never used to use about the MAGA folks, which is un-American. And that's a term straight out of Republican parlance, that they would always sling at the right, or the left, I mean. But yeah, now we're over here, same place we always were, basically, although we're now considered radicalized left, but we stayed put. And the party on the right veered very far to the right. And now we're the ones going, wait, this is un-American. This is not the thing we do. We don't stand for this kind of stuff, right? And I think you're exactly right, Russ. We're now we're now the other side, right? We're now damn it, we're patriots. You guys are out to lunch, right? Which was what we used to get accused of all the time. So
I was at a dinner a couple nights ago with some of my family, and one of the guys there was talking about it. We were talking about how the abrogation of America from certain aspects, especially U.S. aid, was making an opening for China, and how that was, and the implication, something I was saying, whatever, was, well, that's not a good thing, and he was essentially saying, why isn't that a good thing? Why shouldn't Africa want to be supported by China rather than us? And I know why, I think, and I know American aid hasn't always been stringless, and it hasn't always been efficient and things, but I know the strings are many and resilient with Chinese aid, but we're in a position now in which it's harder to argue, you know, why American aid is preferable to Chinese aid. And the Chinese are coming along and saying, well, what are you, where, you know, why would you even want those guys? You know, we've got loads of money and we'll do whatever. And all you got to do is put one of our radio stations in, or if you listen to Ann Applebaum, she talks about the way China and the other oligarchs, Russia as well, are using their international aid, like everybody always has. I mean, we've had Voice of America and things. That all are there to promote your way, but the Russian media is the same. So it's how do you make that argument, and that's harder today. I don't know if you read the Atlantic today or in the last week, but one of the unfortunate side effects possibly to the reduction in U.S. aid in Africa and also in research and medicine is possibly the resurgence of TB, which we haven't really been on. We've been on top of in the West, but not in Africa so much. And if there's even less, it can become more and more virulent. It's already gone back ahead of COVID as being the biggest killer ever, which it always has been. And we're using 60-year-old drugs because it's not in anybody's financial interest to research TB drugs because it's not, an issue in the West. Well, as soon as it kind of exceeds its medical levels in Africa, it can very easily move and become more virulent elsewhere. And we are seeing more examples of it. So those are the things I think we're going to deal with.
Yeah. Now, I think, again, speaking from business and entrepreneurial firm parlance, if you need capital, if you need money, you're going to get it from wherever you can get it with the least restrictions. And so, as USAID falters, Chinese drugs may not be as effective, let's say, speaking to TB, but if at least they're coming without the strings that the U.S. or maybe we're assured that we're going to get them from China and not so much from the U.S. because according to Trump, they're sending us condoms anyway. then maybe we go to China. And I mean, you and I, we buy Chinese goods because they're cheaper, right? And so,
well, and there's a certain naivete on the part of, there's a lot of naivete on the part of the Trump Republicans or Trump supporters. They don't understand soft power at all. That what makes us an influential country in the world is not just the fact that we can blow everybody up or we can send a carrier group in, but because we have fostered relationships with other countries, we've given them money, we have helped them out, we hold up our end of the bargain. That's soft power, and that's a power that has stood us in good stead ever since World War II. I mean, the Marshall Plan was soft power. This current crop, either again because they're idiots or because they're disingenuous, that's just, well, we're just giving them money, we can spend it at home. That's not how this works. Yeah. And they don't seem to understand that. And we are giving away 80 or more years of goodwill across the world that has bought us a lot in like peace, for example. So,
I mean, it's transactional versus investment. It's the view,
exactly,
which has always been the false view. And I know you account for this, speak to this too, Dave, is yes, there are business principles that are involved in government, but government's not a business. It's not your home. So everybody always says, well, like families have to balance their budget, a government has to do that. Well, it's not the same. Those are false equivalences. And so when Elon comes in, and says, oh, I'm going to run it like a business. Well, it isn't a business. It's bigger than a business. It's way more complex than a business. And he doesn't have yet another federal government to get his funding from. to run his personal business that he only runs without any government involvement, which I always think is pretty rich, considering most tech firms have depended on universities that are publicly funded for a lot of research or for the training of the people who are doing the researches. You could speak more to that than I can, Roy. But we don't have a lot of Edisons in their back garage, inventing things. We've got guys who are in universities that are funded by federal grants of one thing, or the research is coming from federal grants. That's where it comes from. Where's that from? Federal government. It's not coming from the state.
Yeah, I would make two comments. One is that when we talk in business, we talk about objective measures. That's where your profits and your dollars and cents come from. And sometimes if you really are paying sole attention to your objective measures, you're forgetting the subjective measures. And that's kind of what you're talking about when you're talking about, okay, objectively, we spend all this money in research and development. And where does it get us? Well, subjectively, we don't know where it takes us until it gets us there. Of course, we could talk about objectively, what did we spend on all the space programs and sending us to space? But subjectively, we've gotten Teflon, and that's the example I always hear about. But other kinds of things that we've gotten from that as well, there are subjective measures. So subjectively, we don't really know what we're getting. Objectively, we hear about the welfare queen, so to say. But subjectively, what are we doing to lots of people who aren't the welfare queen, that we're helping out of a situation where they can either support themselves or stand on their own? So, not only do we have to pay attention to objective measures, we have to think of subjective measures, and those are a little bit squishier. The second thing that I would say is that the way Elon Musk has approached it, I don't think any business person in a rational mind would say this is the way to go about it. I think you don't go in indiscriminately and start cutting in departments and programs and so on, simply saying, look at the fat we found. And I wonder, it's happened between Musk and Marco Rubio. Thank God Marco Rubio has at least a semblance of some balls, but where they get into an argument because you wonder where these department chairs sit. What do you mean you're coming into my department? You're getting rid of things without talking to me about it. What you should really do is say, Marco, I think maybe there's 20% that we could cut out of your department. Could you look at that and tell me where you can find 20%? Not, let me handle it as the chief of the department. Let me try to get in there and figure out. And I've got an objective measure to reach 20%. Now, 20% is probably a bit too high.
Yeah.
But at least you've got a measure to look at rather than coming in and saying, we're going to get rid of this. And the only power he has is that Trump's sitting there saying, yeah, well, we can do that. But that's also poor management, because if you're in a management situation, if you're the CEO of an organization, you're going to try to work within that structure. Of course, Trump's completely blowing the structure apart, or he seems to be, and you wonder what kind of chaos that leads to. I mean, any of us have worked in an organization that says, well, my boss says this, but my boss's boss says something else.
Yeah.
Who do I listen to? And then, well, if my boss's boss is saying this, maybe I need to go to my boss's boss and curry his favor, because then my boss has no real authority at all. So, that's not business-like either. So anyway,
at the risk,
he got me on a rant.
Yeah, that's
The
all
time-
right. At the risk
The
of
timing
drawing,
also.
drawing
Yeah,
at the risk of drawing the inevitable conclusion, when you're hearkening back to the 30s, Roy, one of the things that's key about Hitler's management style was, first of all, he didn't care anything about day-to-day governance. He didn't care about legislation. And what he essentially did is he'd throw out divergent of opinions to multiple people, let them fight it out, and then see who won. And that's kind of the way they would go. I mean, it was almost that simple. So it was whoever could grab the power the first. So this is exactly Hitlerian sort of management, which wasn't good management. And by about 1938, the country was tanking. The economy that was cruising on slave labor and everything else was starting to teeter, and they knew it was trouble. So they were going to have to do something, which is essentially steal other resources from other countries. But this is what you get. So hopefully we're not we're not 5 years away from invading Canada or Mexico.
I was
But
I was going
similar
to say we would never.
management style.
I was going to say we would never look at other countries like Greenland or Canada or
No,
Panama for anything.
not at all.
Never, never.
Yeah. Well, the
Well,
days
you mentioned transactional, and that's very much what Trump does is transactional stuff. And I was reading, I forget where, but was talking about style, and that's not what you do in long-term relationships, right? You don't like between us and Europe, you don't do transactional stuff because you can screw over a company and not pay them, not to just pick a random Trumpian kind of thing, not pay them and make good on that. And but then there's because there's always another country, another company you can go screw the next time, right? But unfortunately, in long-term diplomatic relationships, there's not that many other countries you can go to once you've screwed over your friends. And so it doesn't, transactional stuff does not work in this. You've got to be in for a longer kind of relationship. And that's something that is just horrible, horrible management style and horrible way of dealing with allies. So,
Well, it also implies
And I,
business, it's always a zero-sum game that somebody has to win and somebody has to
exactly.
lose. It's only a successful transaction if I win and you get shafted. Whereas there are plenty of examples where everybody can come out in a satisfactory situation. So everybody makes money, everybody moves ahead, or everybody, gets the land they want. But you reach a certain point in which it's all or nothing, and this is kind of where Putin is right now. And now he's trying to grab a little bit more because he thinks he's got an advantage. That may or may not be, but we'll see. Dave, you had.
you've totally gone past what I was thinking about now. So I think it had to do with Roy's transactional statement and then your follow-up. And I think I would ask people to look at how many people that were involved in Trump's first administration that he just kind of cast to the side and that he tried to sully their name. And you wonder at least how long it's going to take before, say, Elon Musk will have served his usefulness. I mean, Musk's reputation has already been tarnished. Part of this transactional nature showed Trump on the White House lawn in the past week, sitting in a Tesla, saying, "I don't know how it works, but I'm going to buy one. It's American to buy a Tesla." When he's doing away with all the e-charging stations away around the country. So, you talk about, we started with irony. There's part of it, but back to my original point, back to the transactional nature. How quickly is he going to cast free some of these people like Musk or Robert Kennedy Jr., who's really getting beat up over the measles epidemic in Texas and New Mexico? So we'll see.
Yeah. Well, I think let's sort of wrap up. I mean, because we've obviously solved all the issues, but this would be much better if we were in a bar somewhere. But we're where we are. So yeah, I've already been. I thought maybe we would just finish by looking to the future because I mean I think maybe what we're seeing is the old way, the middle way, the third way, all the kind of the post-Clintonian, post-Reagan kind of consensus, if you want to say, of the Democrats anyway, has not succeeded as a vote getter or as something that is compelling as a political narrative. Trump is, for whatever reason, but is probably dependent on Trump. The sort of birth of that is before Trump, and the sort of vestiges will go on after. But is there anybody with the charisma of him that can carry on? And that's the tricky thing. But what happens? Is it if the Democrats win and are allowed to win in 26 and can start to make a shift, and then 28 if there's a Democratic president, can it go back, and should it go back to someplace before, or is there another? And I mean, look into your crystal balls and see. Sounds slightly rude, actually.
Well, yeah.
Crystal.
Yeah. Do you want to go first, Roy, or?
You can if you want to. I'm fine.
I really think if you look at the people that he's got around him right now, I think at some point, I don't know whether it'll be a year, I don't know it'll be 2 years, I don't know it'll be 3 years, but there's going to be another crisis. And because Trump's reaction is the federal government's not going to handle it, we're going to turn it over to the states, it'll be like COVID, it'll be a mish of response. And I think when people see this as a crisis, it'll be interesting to see how we as a nation then respond. Is it something that we're going to fight one another about, say, wearing masks? And I'm not going to say that it's going to be a disease, but I think something's going to happen. Maybe the stock market crashes. Maybe it's a recession. Trump's going to point his fingers at people. Trump's going to say states need to handle it. People, and that's really tough. I can understand the logic behind that, but when we're one country and when, people in Maine can get something that people in California can't, or vice versa, then I think that becomes kind of an issue for us as a country. And so, I think there's going to be some kind of crisis. And when that crisis happens, that'll swing the vote one way or the other. I also think what we're beginning to see is some Democratic politicians, Gavin Newsom has already started to begin to reposition himself closer to the center. I think, in my mind, you look at a media candidate and you look at the guy, he's articulate, he's good looking, he is a media candidate. And whether or not he can swing it or not, who knows? There may be other people that rise to the top. Certainly the governor of Maine has probably not wanted to be in the position she's in, but she's risen to the top. There's a guy in Connecticut who claims that he's trying to build the grassroots, but I started following him on Instagram, and all I see is send me money.
Yeah.
And so I'm not sure he's the guy.
Yeah.
But, there are people out there that I think can rise to the top with a good message. Whether they can govern any better or not, who knows? But I really do think at some point there's going to be a crisis in this administration, and who knows what'll happen. So,
yeah, I think you're right, Dave. And I think the point is to say you're better than Trump is not a high bar to get over. You're smarter or anything like that, but where does it go? Because if Biden seemed to be the reset, but all it was, and it seemed to be successful, and except for a few points of inflation that was coming down, he clearly failed. And so the guy who overturned the Constitution, or tried to, gets back in. That so completely flipped, how we look at how politics works, that it's, Biden wasn't even like Bush Sr., who was riding high all along and then has a recession, so gets punished for it. By a guy who obviously looks very competent, and in many ways was, but that's not the case here. So is everything so different now that we, whoever comes next, it better be something more than just a little bit to the left of Trump, but more to the right of Kamala Harris? Is that, I don't know. What do you think?
I don't know the answer to that either. I can tell you that in the middle of the campaign, I was watching a guy interview people on the street in, I don't know where he was, New York or Boston or wherever. And he came to this guy and he said, "Who are you going to vote for?" And he says, "I'm going to vote for Trump." He said, "Why?" And he said, "Well, I think economics is an issue more than morals and ethics." And I had to stop and think about that, because I've never heard anybody say that. And so I think if Trump's economic policies just go out the window, then, and that's what happened with COVID. I mean, the country was in bad shape economically and socially. And so, Biden took the middle of the road and Biden rode it into victory. Now, if you play what ifs, what if Biden had been competent, at least in the first debate? And
Mhm.
what if or what if Biden had said, stuck to the plan, I'm going to be a one-term president, and opened the Democratic Party up to a legitimate debate?
Mhm.
What could have happened? Would we have been in this mess now? I don't know the answers to those questions, and I don't have any crystal ball better than anybody else, Russ. But
But what if Merrick Garland had begun his
Yeah,
investigation
exactly.
day
Yeah.
one rather than day three, 700 or whatever? I think a whole lot of things would have been different then as well. He'd have been, our president would have been in a jumpsuit right now, but instead isn't. So there's a lot of what ifs. I'm
I
just I'm
think
just wondering if there is something to go back to, or there really has to be a reset forward. But what is a progressive, semi-progressive, semi middle of the road way forward that doesn't break things as well? So
I I personally think we're kind of broken as a country. Um, there's always been the undercurrent of, especially on the right, of an appeal for of authoritarianism being an appeal. There's always been the anti-science, anti-intellectual stuff that's been I mean, everybody has known that since the beginning of the country. But it's never been this close between the sides, I don't think. And there's never been anybody to bring out people from under rocks that suddenly are okay with talking about racism and misogyny in a positive way, or Nazism. I think that should Trump succumb to his cholesterol he's been eating all these years, um, I think JD does not have it in him to be that kind of charismatic leader, cult figure, basically, a cult personality cult figure. I don't think that this is necessarily going away, and I don't know if we are going back. If we had another Biden-ish person come in the center after this and try to reset again, I'm not sure that would really fix much because, first of all, our partners on the world stage would be saying, well, next election, we can get another Trump in here and we'll be screwed again. And to some extent, that's a band-aid kind of thing.
yeah.
The other thing that I'm not sure I would actually want would be somebody that's a populist on the left coming along, energizing that side of the country. I would prefer that to a populist on the right, but I'm not sure either is good. Somebody like AOC, who is articulate, pretty, vehement, and a rabble rouser, which in a good way, I could see her possibly, when she's finally old enough to run, her finally running and getting a great deal of support from the left. I mean, hell, I'd support her. But energizing that side. I mean, that was a big problem in this last election was there was no energizing of the left. The voter turnout sucked for the Democrats. And a lot of people, the Democrats, well, Trump, Biden and Gaza, oh, Trump will fix that. Yeah, okay. So I think we're either going to have somebody, either we're never going to vote again, which is a possibility, or we're going to have somebody in the middle of the road that kind of bumps us along till the next Trumpian person comes along, or we're going to have somebody on the left that energizes that side, and we're not. That takes us into completely uncharted waters. But it might reset us. I don't know. I simply don't know. I just have this. I have this feeling of dread all the time now about the country and where it's going in a way that I never have before. So that's telling you nothing about what
Yeah,
I think.
well, we've had in Louisiana in the 30s had Huey Long, and Huey
My God.
Long was sort of your
Mhm.
left wing, right wing, some kind of wing guy, but he managed to do all of those things, to be absolutely beloved, to be a senator and a governor at the same time, to completely. I mean, he never was quite as extreme with the violence, but it wasn't that far away. So, we have
but
we
he
have
was but he was
people
shot
like
on
that.
the but he was shot on the steps of the Louisiana Capitol.
Well, he was, yes. Uh, so that's how it ended. So I think this is the interesting thing. We have had the little snippets of people who could have been that way, and and they weren't, because of either the belief in the system in general held out, or the system itself was more resilient than we thought, or they were weak, or they died. And that sometimes happens. And certainly the right wing thought Roosevelt was that guy. And there were times along the way when he kind of flirted with more power than probably was healthy. On the other hand, it's hard to see us having survived the Second World War with, I don't know, Alf Landon as president. So I think these are the kind of things that are the contrafactuals. Well, we can obviously go on and on and on, but I think it's been quite interesting just getting that. We haven't railed too much on the T word, but it's kind of hard not to. We are in strange times. Over here, people are always asking me, well, when is a Democrat going to step up? And I go, well, they are. They just don't. There's nothing that can be done at the national level at this point except to shout. And that's kind of pointless at this point. And the way the electoral system goes, it'll crank up in about 2 years, although it's been going on already underneath. But you don't want to be out there too long in the firing line. So I guess we will see as it goes. So anyway, well, thank you, gentlemen. We will reconvene for another one of these at some point in the future when there's an interesting topic, or we'll just come up with another one. How about we do that? Okay.
Sounds good.
Bye-bye, everybody.